Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer and artist behind comics like Joker Killer Smile, Gideon Falls, Black Hammer, and the currently being Kickstarted graphic novel Cosmic Detective. It's Jeff Lemire. Thanks for coming on, Jeff.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with the basics, like the question that used to be really easy to ask, and now it's just kind of feels like a loaded question. How are you doing?
I'm doing relatively, in the grand scheme of things, I'm doing pretty good. Being a cartoonist, something like this doesn't dramatically change your day-to-day in terms of my work. I'm fortunate in that respect where I mostly work alone and anyway, so I can still keep working during all this. I know many other people aren't in that fortunate spot, so I kind of count my blessings there. I'm spending more time at home with my family, and that's not a bad thing. And so I'm just trying to stay positive and, keep working to kind of, when I can, to sort of take my mind off everything like everyone else and stay sane. But yeah, it really puts a lot of things in perspective and makes you realize how lucky you are to just be able to do something like make comics every day and enjoy that and to enjoy your work like that, because when something like this happens, so many people are suffering and struggling and don't have sort of that the fortunate sort of place I have that I can go and do my work and have an outlet for that. So I just kind of counting my blessings and staying positive as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, you have your studio is either at your house or close to your house, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very close, and the building it's an old warehouse building, and most of the other tenants in the building are film production studios or post production studios, and they're all shut down. So basically, since this began a couple months ago, there's nobody in the building at all. So it's been okay for me to just come in to my studio, and so really my day to day hasn't changed all that much. There's no one else around the building. Once I get in the studio, it always was just me by myself anyway. So it's kind of, you just get in your zone for a few hours each day and do your work, and then come home.
Well, you guys definitely picked. I mean, if you have a set schedule, a really good way to mess it up is to have a Kickstarter, from what I've heard. And that's exactly what you've done. You guys are Matt Kindt and David Rubin are currently kickstarting a new oversized hardcover graphic novel called Cosmic Detective. I love that. The premise is really simple. Like, a lot of times it's like I have to read like a full paragraph. But for this, I feel like when a god is murdered, who solves the crime is like really easy. It's really nice. You've been working on it for a long time, since 2018 to be specific. We're going to get into the process of making it in a second, but I did want to ask about kind of what it started with, because you have, like, you and Matt are friends, and David is somebody that you guys are both. I think you guys have both worked with. Hey, he worked on Black Hammer, and Matt's obviously worked with him on Ether. But what came first, the team or the idea in some capacity?
Well, if I could, I might misremember some of this, but as far as I can remember, I had that title as something, So, it sounds really dumb, but honestly, half the stuff I've come up with, it's like been a title first. In this case, I just had this, for some reason, that popped in my head, this sort of big kind of, it almost sounds like one of those old pulp novels or something, but with like a weird twist. Like I said, this big kind of cosmic detective. It just sounded like something kind of big and simple and easy to wrap your head around, or like an evocative title. And I was, I think, toying around with a few things of what that could be. Fully, to be completely honest, there were a couple failed projects I had kind of just been discussing with Marvel back in, 2017, 18 or something. I won't say what characters or whatever they were, but they were sort of more in the cosmic realm of Marvel stuff. And those projects never really manifested for different reasons. And some of the ideas, like I just kept kind of, my wheels were turning, and I kind of saw how I could take some of those concepts I had been playing around with and kind of make them into something new and my own. So this title and sort of a few of the ideas were lingering, and then Matt and I, we must have been at a convention together somewhere a couple of years ago. We're really good friends, but we only get to see each other probably once a year at some con that we both decide to go to just so we can hang out. I don't remember which one it was a couple of years ago, but we ended up somewhere together, and like we do, we always talk about, oh, we should do something else together. And we'd done a couple little things together, but they were work for hire things. Like we'd done a few things at Valiant together, and we found doing that it was really effortless for us to co-write stuff, because it's almost like we share a brain and we both have the same work ethic and a lot of the same sort of sensibilities and the same kind of stories that we like to tell. And it was just really easy for us to split up the workload, saying, okay, well, if the story is this and this, you write those scenes, I'll write these scenes. And, we just sort of, it was very easy. So we knew we could work together, but we wanted to do something create our own, that we owned ourselves. And I had this title, and I think I must have just told him the title and this basic idea. And it was just enough for us to start riffing. And really it was almost an experiment where we, over a year or two, I would write a scene, I'd write like maybe a 10-page scene. And I'd kind of leave it almost on a little cliffhanger, and Matt would have no idea what I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost like a challenge. Okay, what are you going to do with this? I pass it on to him, and he'd do the same. He'd write 10, 20, 15, whatever, how many pages he kind of got inspired to write, and he'd leave it in some wacky, unexpected twist that I would have to deal with. And so it was like this weird challenge, but it really just, I think the fun of it and sort of the fact that we weren't doing it for any publisher, that we were just doing it for ourselves. We were just like kind of writing it for each other to make each other smile and sort of get excited. I think it shows, in the final product. And surprisingly, it feels very cohesive. The benefit of it at the end is once you kind of get through the first draft of doing it that way, then we could go back and kind of shape it a bit more and craft it and add things and remove things that weren't quite fitting and make it into a cohesive story, So that was the process. We just kind of did that on our own time over a couple of years without any pressure. And the joy of doing that, even if it's create your own, if you have a publisher in mind and you just kind of puts a deadline on it or pressure on it or whatever. And we were just doing it for ourselves with the idea that, if it doesn't work out, we had fun trying something just as friends. And if it does, then we can figure out publishers and everything later. So yeah, that's just what we did. And I think it was always Rubin. Like we just always, me and Matt loved David. Like I got to work with him on Black Hammer stuff, and he's just in that with Ether too. And he's one of those artists, they're very rare, where you give them a script and they just make it better. Like they'll take your ideas, but do them so much better than you even could have imagined. He has such an imagination, and he just elevates the material, and he's so fast and reliable, and so there was never any question he's the guy that we wanted to work with. And yeah, so that's the origin, I guess, the origin story of it.
I think there's so many different places I want to go off this. First, I'm just going to start with a ridiculous anecdote. Do you know the cartoonist Kyle Starks?
Kyle
Starks. He did Assassin Nation with Erica Henderson and a number of other books. But he for Free Comic Book Day this year, he actually just asked Twitter. He's like, "Give me a title, and I'm gonna make a free comic to put up on Twitter." Yeah. And so like his entire Twitter thread became just a ton of ridiculous names, and he ended up choosing Karate Prom. And he made a comic based off of the name Karate Prom. And I just thought it was such an amazing thing. But it is kind of, I do like the idea that it all started with cosmic and detective and finding a way to marry those two ideas in the middle. And I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. It's like, so when you have those titles, I don't know which other projects you've worked on where you had those, like a name first or something like that. Is it just having these words in your head and you're like, what can I do with this? How do I turn this into something?
Funny. I mean, everyone always asks where the idea for a certain story or a certain series came from. And it's always so hard to answer that question, honestly, because they all come from different places. And it can be like the weirdest, most random little thing that sparks an idea in your head. It's almost hard to explain that to people. You see something one day, you hear a word, you see, it can be the weirdest thing that just sparks something, and then ideas start to build around it like a snowball.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can just be a title like that, where it evokes ideas. That title evokes ideas. You want to know what that is. Cosmic Detective, what is that? And And by all the questions that title raises, that's your story. You start answering those questions, and
Yeah.
it builds around it. Sometimes that can be the way a story forms. Other times it could be like a drawing that you do. It's just some character that you were doodling, and then you just start building a story around that character. Like that's kind of how Sweet Tooth formed. I just had this kid with antlers, and then the image of this kid, the story I just started asking questions about this kid, and you build the story, around it. It can come from anything, but a lot of times I've been finding lately, I'll get an idea and it's okay. Like it's something, but it's not like I'm not fully excited by it yet. And it kind of just will linger for a year and kind of I'll keep coming back to it because something's not clicking. And then I'll have a separate idea that's somewhere else, and that one's not quite clicking, but all of a sudden, for some reason, one day you realize, what if I put those two ideas together?
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of the tension of two different ideas, the juxtaposition of two different things, that's usually when the spark really flies. And with Cosmic Detective, that was it, right? Doing those two words together is what creates the world and the story. And then Matt and I just went nuts with it,
Wasn't that the fusion was what happened with Gideon Falls, right?
Yeah, exactly. That one was, I had an idea that, like, it's an old comic that I'd worked on for years and years before I ever got published. That just never, it was like kind of this formative work where I was still learning how to write and how to draw and kind of finding myself. And it was this project I kept working on it forever and ever that I finally just abandoned. And then I had another idea for some of the supernatural stuff. Got in Gideon Falls and tried pitching that or tried developing it for a couple of years, and it just didn't quite catch,
Yeah.
And then the same thing happened where Sorrentino kind of became available, and we kind of knew the tone of the sort of story we wanted to do, and I just was like, wanted to come up with something for him, and I just had these two separate ideas, and again, you just put them together and all clicked into place and became the real idea, So that can happen. It doesn't always work that way, but I find that more and more that seems to be what happens, where I get kind of two halves of ideas that end up coming together the right way.
I do think it's funny sometimes where we're always so interested in like the very like genesis of these ideas. And it, like I don't remember who it was, but I talked to a cartoonist one time who told me that they had drawn something when they were like 12 and they were like looking through their old sketchbooks and they came across this character and they're like, who is this person? And then they made a comic about it. And I was like, that's amazing. It's like it's not like they went in with designs to like make a comic off that, but it came from that.
Yeah, even the origins of, like, if you look at something like the entire Hellboy universe that Mignola created, he just did that as Hellboy started as a convention sketch he did for someone who wanted a monster, right? And he just kind of, for fun, drew this character and ended up becoming Hellboy, There's no grand design or, like, ambition behind it, but it just sparked something for him. And that's the thing, it's those ideas, everyone gets ideas, not just writers. Everyone has ideas all day when they're walking around. But I think writers are the ones that kind of stop themselves and say, wait a minute, what if this was actually something? And what if you actually followed this idea through? And, most ideas don't start from some really inspired grand place. They're usually pretty silly or frivolous, but you kind of build them into something better over time,
Yeah. Well, one thing when I was researching this, one of the things that I really loved when I read it, and you talked about it, is basically how you and Matt kind of made like a choose your own adventure story where you guys were taking the next chapter after you make that choice. Like he would finish and then you would take it over and then he would take it over after that. And it was kind of surprising each other throughout. But the thing I really love about that is, and this, I don't mean this in a remotely negative way. I had Matt on the podcast not that long ago to talk about folklords and Heck Treasury and everything like that. And Matt is like a comic book mad scientist. He's like always finding new and different ways to make comics, like the Heck Treasury with all the stickers and all the stuff that he's going to be doing. And I know you guys are pals. I know you guys have worked together for a bit, but it also feels like you're kind of kindred spirits in a way as storytellers. What is it about Matt that makes him such an appealing collaborator for you?
Well, I mean, all the people I end up collaborating with on projects have two things more than once. Like the people who have become kind of more long-term collaborators, whether it's Matt or Dustin, Lynn, or Sorrentino. The two things they all have in common are they share a really good work ethic, like I do. So they're all artists or writers that take it seriously and produce work, and they're never late. And I love that about them. They're also all really talented. And they're all really good people that I love hanging out with. It's kind of that simple. Matt is just of all the people I've ever met in comics since I started self-publishing in the, almost 20 years ago. He's just one of my favorite human beings, and he's so nice and kind, and he's just a good person, And then on top of that, he happens to be incredibly inventive and talented, and we just share a lot of the same sensibilities. We like the same kind of movies, the same kind of comics. We like to draw the same way. You know what I mean? We just have a lot. We're on the same wavelength, and you don't find that very often in people. It's kind of rare. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it does. Yeah, no,
I mean, yeah.
I mean, it's just like, I think the thing about Matt, it's like when I was reading through the Kickstarter and I read that there was multiple bombastic gatefold pages of art and story that will literally fold out and let you fall into them. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't something I could see you doing, but it's definitely something I could see Matt doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think Matt and I, we both came from more of an indie comics background, not mainstream comics. I think we both grew up reading superhero comics and loving them, and we appreciate them, obviously. I mean, I still, you can see from Black Hammer and stuff how much I love the history of superhero comics and everything. But when we were starting to be cartoonists, each of us in like the late 90s, early 2000s, we both came at it from a very different place. We weren't trying to write Marvel comics or DC comics. We wanted to write and draw really personal, kind of experimental black and white comics, and we came up through like Top Shelf and Fantagraphics and all these things, 20 years ago, when people really became about not just telling stories, but trying to be innovative and trying to push the way you use the language of comics. I think we both tried to do that a lot, and so I think we came at it from that. And then if you take those sensibilities and then you start to apply them to some of this more fun genre stuff like superhero books or something like Cosmic Detective, you can do some really innovative, fun things playing with format and stuff that just kind of goes back to our DIY kind of roots, especially this now that we're kind of kickstarting and that we don't have a publisher. It really feels in a lot of ways like we're going back to doing one of those books together. And that's part of the fun, is challenging each other and trying to push the language of comics and the way you use layouts and pages and stuff and be inventive is something I think we've both always been attracted to.
Yeah. Does it feel, when you're creating this, obviously it's a much more extended creative process than you're used to on like something, like something you're collaborating with others on. Like if you're doing, I guess even like something like Underwater Welder or frog catchers or anything like that, you have set deadlines and everything like that. But with this one, you have a much more extended runway to put it together. You don't really have a home for it in mind, at least, because you have like it's crowdfunding and everything like that. How does that change the creative process? Is it pretty freeing, or do you still feel like you need to have
incredible.
Is it?
No, it's the best ever. Yeah. I mean, I've actually been doing that now for about 5 years. I've done all my projects that I've done myself, like going back to, I guess if I look back on what I've done, Roughneck, Frog Catchers, Royal City, all these books that I've drawn myself over the last decade or half decade, I've done them all almost completely before I even contacted a publisher,
Wow.
And I'm really lucky, let's be honest, because I can write all this stuff for other artists and do some of the more mainstream stuff to make a good living, and then I can literally have the freedom to do my own personal projects on my own time without having to worry about a publisher or a deadline, and just do them and let them be whatever they want to be, free of any sort of pressure. And now I'm kind of addicted to that feeling, where that freedom that you get, it's irreplaceable. And just to be able to fail and take your time and find something, and it's really the best way to create. So that's why we both went that way with Cosmic Detective too. We just knew we had that freedom would be great for the project. And it's just, the more free you are, the more positive you are, the better the work is, and deadlines and pressures and all that stuff just kind of cuts into that. So yeah, it really opens you up creatively for sure.
Well, and you're at that point, you're just creating for yourself, right?
That's right. You're creating for yourself, and you always have that safety net of, if this doesn't work and it's not good, I can just put it in the shelf or put it in a drawer and never, and if it works out, then I'll publish it. And once you have that freedom, that complete freedom, it's amazing what the kind of work you can do when you can really take risks and push things. and you're not scared to fail, I mean, that's true creativity, and it's almost irreplaceable, that feeling. It's really a wonderful way to do things. So most of the books I do now on my own, I kind of have that kind of process where I'll just do something and then figure out the publisher and everything else later.
That's amazing, because I know that one of the things that people bring up the most to you is just like, wow, you make a lot of comics. Like, how do you do that? But it is kind of amazing, because that means that there's like this other layer behind it that we don't necessarily know about. I'm not saying that you have like a graveyard of forgotten works or something like that, but
well, you know what I do. The thing is that people don't know. Like, I honestly do. I'm usually about 2 books ahead of whatever they're seeing or whatever's announced, right? So, for instance, Frog Catchers came out I don't know when it came out, last fall, a full graphic novel, but I've already had the next graphic novel done since that came out, and I'm working on the next project after that. I'm so far ahead that I can fail and I can take breaks, but I think that's why it looks like I'm so prolific, is because I'm so far ahead on things.
Yeah,
constantly have, but yeah.
That's amazing. Well, okay, so I want to ask about David's contributions to Cosmic Detective, because one thing I really liked that I read was, and this is a direct quote, it was written specifically for David Rubin. What does that mean for the creative process? Does it mean just finding ways to lean into his strengths as much as possible, or is it more precise than that?
It's not as precise as you'd think. I think we both knew what David would bring, meaning visually he would. Things would be a lot more exciting on the page than we could ever script. His layouts and his design would be so. We just knew from experience he would take it to somewhere, a whole other level. So we didn't have to worry too much about trying to art direct him or influence the visual storytelling. We could just have complete faith that he would excel at that. And we also knew what kind of visual imagination he'd bring and what kind of aesthetic. So like we kind of knew when we were thinking of this cosmic mythology. We almost imagined it in his drawings and his type of characters and this sort of Kirby influence stuff that he does. So you almost were creating it knowing how he would render it in a way, and that kind of just made it specific for us. If anything, we could kind of get more specific in the mythology and the creation of that sort of the side of it. Almost thinking of it as David Rubin drawings, it gave it a specificity for us that helped our scripting.
Well, and I know that. So on the Cosmic Detective Twitter, there was a tweet that showed 4 influences. It was Chinatown, it was Kirby's New Gods, it was Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, which actually is something very specific to David that I didn't. I would never have picked Edward Hopper as something that was like tremendously influential to him. But then Twin Peaks, which is, I know, a big thing for you. I mean, I think when I look at that and like Twin Peaks and all those other ones, you can see each of you represented in even just that single tweet, which, I'm not saying it's all of you, but it's something. And I guess there's part of it that when you're kind of writing for somebody, it's like going into the project and going into putting it together, knowing you all have like kind of the same roots and same direction you're heading in. Like that's more of what you're talking about with David.
Yeah, when people say, like, for me anyway, when they say like I'm writing for a specific artist, it's not so much I can't speak to what other writers do or how they consider this, but for me anyway, it's never. I'm not specifically catering the script or the way I write the script to them. It's more just choosing the right artist for the right projects and the right worlds. They have the right aesthetic for that world, or you say you want to do you decide. Like when I wanted to work with Dustin, we just knew each other's aesthetics. So you start thinking of ideas that fit that aesthetic, and that's how we came up with Descender. And then really the scripting of stuff it kind of stays the same, but you created a world together that, is something shared, and that you're both kind of, the idea is sprung from thinking about the way you both work. And so it's more the start of the project like that, and choosing the right collaborator. That's sort of where you tailor it for an artist more than the specifics.
Sure.
That's how I do it anyway.
I don't know why, but in my head, David Rubin is like the perfect artist for a comic called Cosmic Detective. There's just some perfection there.
You're damn straight. Yeah, exactly. It's like it had to be him. Of course that's David.
I love it.
Yeah, no one else could do that.
Well, I want to ask about Kickstarter. The funny thing is the most common question that I got from patrons and from people submitting questions for this podcast was, whether the pandemic played a part at all in you guys going down the Kickstarter route. I'm guessing no, but was that the case?
Yeah, no, it did not. You know, it's funny. Matt had done a couple Kickstarters, as you know, over the last year and a half. He did the Heck Treasury with his studio mates, and then he did My Management board game
and the record.
And the record, that was the first one. So he had been doing this and constantly pitching me on it, and I'm like, Matt, I don't know, I want to deal with this. Let's just get a publisher so we can just write it and not have to worry about any of the logistics. And you know what I mean? I came up self-publishing. I did not want to do it again. You know, it's nice to be able to do the work and pass it off and let someone else worry about like the printer and all that stuff. But Matt was like kind of adamant, like of pumping the tires of doing this and the freedom that he felt from it. So, you know, I just came around to it and thought, well, if he's enjoying doing these that much, and it kind of gives us that freedom not to have to worry about finding a publisher beforehand and all that stuff, like, why not give it a shot, you know? And I liked the sort of return to our roots of self-publishing of it, because that's when me and Matt met. It was when we were both self-publishing, and it just kind of seemed like fun. And I'm always up for doing something different, you know, to keep, you know, you do enough books like I've done, and you don't want to get stale and stagnant. And, you know, I've worked with every publisher at this point and done all kinds of stuff. And I hadn't done this yet. So it's always good to challenge yourself and do something different and put your work out on a different platform. And so anyways, he long story short, he sold me on the idea eventually. So that was always kind of the plan. And then, when the pandemic hit, it was like, well, do we still do this or do we wait? And if anything, it just felt like, well, let's just do it now, because people can't go to comic shops right now. And I think they're hungry for new content and new stories to read. So maybe they'll get excited about this. And it seems to have worked, you know, and because people have been supporting it and it's doing well. So yeah, I mean, that's really the extent of it. I wouldn't say it wasn't as if we were set up with a publisher and then something happened and we couldn't, you know, they had to back out and we had to find some other way to publish it or whatever. It wasn't that at all.
I do think it's interesting how there seems to be like this idea that there's been like an influx of Kickstarters from notable creators over the last like 2 months since like the kind of pandemic hit. And like, I've seen some people say things like, this must be a reaction to the pandemic, but I also think that kind of discounts how much planning goes into a Kickstarter.
Yeah, people often, I mean, this is just, you can't expect people who don't make comics to understand the full process of making comics or you know, the logistics of it or how far ahead we actually work on this stuff. It's probably not fair. It's of course they have those reactions, but I think people don't realize like all these books, when you're seeing something announced, it's generally there's a lot of planning and stuff that's gone into it and a lot of work that's been done on it before we ever announce anything. So I mean, this stuff was all really well in the wheels were turning well before everything happened, you know.
I do have to ask, was one of your rules of agreeing with Matt to do a Kickstarter that the first stretch goal had to be him getting a cosmic mohawk?
No, he had done that on his own. His daughter had given him a cosmic mohawk. I think he just pretended that was part of the Kickstarter, but I guess I shouldn't say that.
I love it. Well, I do like though that so let's say down the path you get a publisher to work with, or perhaps, I don't know, maybe you already have one. I don't even know. But Kickstarter, like the nice thing is like with Kickstarter, it allows you to do a lot of things perhaps you wouldn't have been able to do. Like this hardcover is oversized. You know, it may even have gilded pages if you hit certain stretch goals. Yeah. I mean, was a big selling point for this whole thing being able to like fine tune it and turning it into something really special?
Yeah, I mean, going back to our self-publishing days, I think one thing Matt and I always loved was like when you're doing work back then when we were working with indie publishers and doing stuff, you could really kind of like, you didn't have to stick to a standard format or a standard page size or a book size or anything. You could really tailor the book to something special, and it felt like a unique object that people were buying, you know. It wasn't like this mass-produced thing. And I think the joy of Kickstarter was that, yeah, we could do something like that, where this would be super deluxe, super limited edition version of this story, where it would be this oversized hardcover with like gilded pages and whatever else we add to it that no publisher would ever probably agree to because it's not cost effective, you know?
Right.
And knowing that, you know, at the end of this thing, we probably have maybe 3,000-4,000 backers, and so that's a very small print run, and this copy, this edition that goes out will be like one time only, and like this really limited version of it, and then if we ever do publish it again in a wider way, it'll probably be much more of a traditional mass market paperback version that is more affordable for whoever wants just to read the story, So it is fun to be able to make this special kind of limited edition thing, Yeah.
Well, and one of the neat things about it too is like, you, Matt, David, each of you has like fans. Like you probably have like hardcore fans, and you have people who really like having something that is like a special version of a book on their stands, on their shelves. Like for example, I really love Carl Kerschel's The Abominable Charles Christopher. And I have like, he has like this one version of the collections that is like all fuzzy, and it's got like a red, and there's one that's red and there's one that's green, and it's just like he only did a very limited run of it, and I have that because like I'm like a hardcore fan, and and it's just like there's something like I think one of the nice things about Kickstarter is like it really lessens the distance between those types of fans that really, really want to support you passionately and the creators.
Yeah, exactly. And they get something special from us that won't be available later, And I know for me, you mentioned Twin Peaks or whatever. Like the one thing I'm kind of nutty about fandom-wise is Twin Peaks. So I know what that's like. You want when the new box set comes out, I'm the one who gets like the special edition that's numbered, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I get that, and I know that we have fans like that, too. So this is kind of that for them, and that sort of special thing that it's only going to be available once, and it's going to be different and something a bit more than what anyone else can get, and it's kind of cool to be able to offer that stuff again. You can't really do that when you're working with a publisher as much, So yeah, it's really cool.
And now a quick word from our sponsor. My friends at Third Eye Comics are one of the largest brick-and-mortar comic book and pop culture stores in the entire country, with over 14,000 square feet of combined retail space. But not only that, they love comics, and they're ready to help you with all of your comic needs. Even better, the fact that you can shop online at shop.thirdeyecomics.com and get super fast, same-day, $5 flat rate shipping within the United States. And they even ship worldwide too. They're one of the friendliest teams you can find in any comic shop, with a huge selection in 3 convenient locations in Annapolis, Maryland, Lexington Park, Maryland, and Richmond, Virginia. You can find them on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, as well as their website at thirdeyecomics.com. Visit their site and order today. And now, back to the show. Moving on from Cosmic Detective, I did want to talk. We had talked before about Black Hammer and its like extended stories, all the different stories that kind of spun from it and everything like that. And this ties into what we were talking with Cosmic Detective. But I think one of the common things is everyone thinks you had, when you were going into Black Hammer, is you had this big master plan to basically make, instead of like the Mignola verse, like the Lemire verse or the Black Hammer verse. But that wasn't really the case. You never intended to extend beyond the initial book. But, I guess when it comes to things like that, and really, I mean, I guess like all these projects, like what is it, or really for Black Hammer, I guess, but what guides you? Is it like a potential collaborator? Is it looking at which stories would fit best in this world? Or is it, I don't know, is it going back to that thing where it's just like, it's the inspiration that you can't really point to, it just happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, when we're talking specifically about the Black Hammer books, and when I decide, well, I want to do this new Black Hammer book or whatever, there is no master plan. I kind of wish there was sometimes, because I have a hard time sometimes deciding which books to do or not. But, really it comes down to like, there's already a ton of superhero comics out there in the world, and there are every month. So I often get what I think are fun ideas for superhero stories that I'm like, that could be a cool Black Hammer story or whatever. But that's not enough, it has to be, for it to make it to make the cut or whatever, it's got to offer something kind of different and some kind of a twist on what you expect, or some kind of a really emotionally driven story that you don't normally see in superhero comics, or something that just makes it Black Hammer, whatever that means, And so I'm kind of just trying to be really picky about what I do now and with that universe, because I don't want to water it down or just
do things to do things.
Expanding it. Yeah. So, I mean, there was an initial rush of excitement I did the original series, which was obviously something I developed for a long time. And then I started doing the expanded universe. It was like all these opportunities flooded, and I got really excited, and I got to do a bunch of stories that I had always wanted to do, like Dr. Star stuff and all these other things. But then when those initial kind of wave of inspiration passes, and you start digging a little deeper for stuff, you have to be real careful. At least I do, to not just do something just to do it, and so now I'm just trying to, it has to really kind of tick off a lot of different criteria before I kind of see it through. It's a book, so I guess if any, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Totally.
I'm just being a lot pickier lately about what I want to do with that world, and if it's something that's going to get published under the Black Hammer thing, I got to make sure it feels special to me and something I'm really excited about.
No, it totally answers my question. I mean, honestly, like, this is kind of a cheesy way to put it, but I'm going to put it this way anyways. But it feels like you can't, it shouldn't be you finding the idea. It's like the idea needs to find you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When you start digging, well, I gotta come up with a story, I think you've already lost it. It's like, I just wait for the right ones to find me, and it's got to be something I really get excited about. And it offers something a little different and new that I haven't done already in the universe. And yeah.
I'm going to totally butcher his name, but whatever led you to working with Tonci Zonjic, I'm incredibly happy that you did so, because I'm like a super fan of his work.
Yeah, he's unreal, man. Oh my God, like he'll hand in those pages, and I just don't even know what to say half the time. They're so staggering and beautiful, and he's obviously put so much craft into them. And I feel my compliments now. I'm running out of ways to say how amazed I am and how awesome the pages look. It's just, without it sounding insincere, because he's unreal. It's just crazy. He's such a great storyteller, first of all, let alone the way he renders the pages. And so, yeah, I mean, I got really lucky to be able to do that book with him. And that one came about, I actually was going to draw that book myself, and I had started, I think I maybe did about 10 or 15 pages of the first issue. And for whatever reason, I just stopped, and I just it didn't feel right. And I just kind of didn't feel like I wanted to draw it anymore. But I still wanted to do the book, so I was lucky to hook up with Tonci, because he's elevated it into something way better than it could have been. So yeah.
I remember when he was doing Lobster Johnson over in like the Mignolaverse stuff, and I remember at first I was just like, I don't know, I've never heard of this guy. And then afterwards I was like, this was like, I think the time, maybe it was like post Guy Davis, it was like James Herron and Tyler Crook were working on BPRD stuff, and and so then you had like Mignola and Duncan Fegredo over in Hellboy, and I was just like, enough of those schmoes, give me more of this Tonci guy. I just want more of him.
Yeah, he's so good. Here's a fun fact for like going way back, is when my very first gig that I got, well, actually it was my second gig I ever got as a writer at DC, was I launched a Superboy series in 2009 or something, 2009. And we were looking for an artist for that, and his name came up back then, and I was pushing for him, but I think maybe he was already too busy or something. So we almost got to do Superboy together.
You made it happen eventually.
I kind of wish we had, because I want to see what that book would have looked like, but yeah.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about comics, is like with collaboration, it's like, if Tonci drew the Superboy book, it would have been a way different book.
Totally different book, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, like, there's all these kind of like sliding doors type situations where if you had just maybe, like, if you had drawn, Skull Digger and Skeleton Boy instead of Tonci, like, that book probably would have been way different.
Way different, yeah. Yeah, and it's hard to say what was better. It just would have been a different comic, And,
yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, that what you say. I mean, there's stories I can tell you. Well, I can't tell you, but like things where I've been at editorial retreats for like Marvel or DC back in the day, where certain creators pitched a certain book and it didn't happen, and someone else did it instead, and it became a massive hit. You just wonder, wow, if that other creator had stuck to it, we never would have had this book, or this creator's career wouldn't have launched when it did. And it's so funny the way things work out. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to ask about was, I made Matt seem like this wild, mad scientist earlier, but I do think that you've been doing some really interesting stuff lately with, like Black Hammer has its, Hellboy and BPRD, like, expanded universe. you've been working with Black Label with like Killer Smile and The Question with that. I don't even know what they call it. I think it's like Prestige Plus or something like that. That's supersized one.
Yeah.
Cosmic Detective is oversized and it's hardcover. And you're doing a lot of really interesting stuff with your graphic novels you're doing. This goes back to your indie roots, but do you like experimenting with formats and what you do with comics? Does that keep you invested and excited about it?
You got to, yeah. I mean, drawing comics is so labor intensive, and not just to make it sound like some horrible job, because it's not. It's amazing, but it really is hard work to sit down and draw for 8 hours a day every day on a story. So, you got to find ways to keep yourself excited, and often if you're just doing traditional panel layouts or whatever, after a while it can get pretty monotonous, so if anything it just comes from that, where you're like, okay, well, let's do something wild and like try to use the language of comics to their fullest, to experiment and do something weird, and that keeps you excited day in and day out doing that stuff. So yeah, definitely it just comes from and the more excited I am, and the more invested I am in the work, and it shows to the reader. So you gotta, that's really where it comes from, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think too, it's like sometimes that can have a reciprocal experience, like you were saying, for the readers, but not just that. It's like, I'm going to be honest, like I'm not a big Joker fan. I never in a million years expected to.
Me neither.
Yeah, I know. I read that, and that was like, it was very surprising. But the funny thing is like, you read Joker Killer Smile, and I partially did it because of the format, but also because I read that you were not a fan, and so going into it read like a Joker story that was for people who are not big fans of the Joker, and I don't mean that in a negative way. Trust me.
No, that's what it was. So don't worry. Okay. I don't like the Joker either. I don't like what that character kind of has come to represent in pop culture. It's kind of gross, and I'm not a big fan of like the way people identify with the violence of that character and everything else. So it became, but that's where the story came from. To your point, it's like, initially I'm like, I don't know, I don't want to do a Joker story, but then you start thinking about why you don't want to do a Joker story, and what you could do to almost comment on that sort of side of the character and do something fresh. And so, it's interesting how that works out.
I mean, I do think like some of this stuff is really interesting too, because it's like, okay, so last time you were on the podcast, I think the very last thing we talked about was you had just done a panel somewhere at a convention, and you'd said that you were no longer doing for hire work, or at least for the time being. And then, since then, since we talked, you did in Vera 5, you did Joker Killer Smile, you did, and then there's Batman the Killer Smile also coming up, The Question, The Deaths of Vic Sage, and then you're also doing, which I think this is really cool, you're doing a single page in a jam issue of Legion of Superheroes number 8, which I think is rad. So yeah. That obviously changed. Like, what is it? Just like opportunity presenting itself, or is it?
It is. Like you get these high-minded things. I'll be blunt with you. You're like, I'm a successful creator-owned creator. I don't have to do work for hire anymore. And you feel like kind of like whatever about it for like 5 minutes, and you say something dumb on a panel, well, you're never going to do work for hire. But then someone offers you the chance to do The Question with Dennis Cowan, and you're like, well, yes, I'm going to do The Question with Dennis Cowan. It's like those characters are just, you grow up with them, and you have this love of them, and when these opportunities come, sometimes they're just great, and you want to do them because they're fun and they're exciting. And so I guess I'm trying to just saying, maybe I'm learning to never say never to that stuff, because what you think one day, you probably feel something else another day. So I'm just trying to learn just to shut up and just do what I want to do, and not try to define it, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing is, I think it is, we live in a binary world where it's like one thing or another. And I often think that people forget that it's just like, sometimes, like you probably felt like that day. Like you probably felt like that when we talked about it, but things change. Like, I mean, this is just me as an outsider, but I feel like Black Label kind of fits you because...
Well, that's the thing. Black Label really opened up stuff, because I've always loved the characters, but I don't necessarily love doing like the mainline in continuity Marvel DC stuff anymore. Not because I don't love the characters, or I don't even even like the editors and the creators that you would work with, but it's too limiting and too restrictive, and for me creatively, and especially when you start doing create your own stuff and you get a taste of the freedom of building your own worlds and not having to answer to anyone, it's really kind of hard to go back to that. But then Black Label gives you the best of both worlds, where you can kind of still get your hooks on some of these characters that you love, but treat them a little more personally and have a little more freedom. So yeah, it's sort of opened up opportunities for me that are really fun. And the joy of my career now is that I don't need to do that stuff to make a living, but I can pick those projects that truly inspire me and just do them for the joy of doing them. And that's a pretty fortunate spot to be, but I'm going to take advantage of it for sure.
Well, and I think that's really cool because it allows you, like, when that Legion thing was announced, I think it was announced yesterday, and you actually replied to the tweet and you were like talking about how excited you were. And it's like that freedom that we're talking about allows you to, I would never in a million years would have imagined you to do a single page in a jam book, but like there was like almost like a childlike glee to your tweet. I don't mean to like psychoanalyze.
Sure, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it is a child. I grew up, one of the two biggest influences on me when I was a kid was Perez and Wolfman's Teen Titans and Giffen and Levitz's Legion. Those are the books that those are the things that got me reading comics and made me fall in love with these big shared universes back in the early 80s, mid 80s, I guess. And so for Bendis to email me one day and say, do you want to draw a page in the Legion? It's like, yeah, of course that's, so, I mean, not to diminish it, but to draw one page, but, I'm taking 2 or 3 days to do that. And so it's not like it's like a huge life commitment. And it's just like, yeah, it's like a really cool dream come true to like get to draw those characters and be a part of the history of that book that I love so much. And so of course you want to grab those opportunities,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it totally makes sense, but I do like, going back to the freedom thing, it's just like this, it allows you to not take work just to take work. It allows you to find it's kind of like, the idea of like that you working with this cosmic detective because it's a name that just makes sense to you. It's like if a project is offered to you and it makes sense, you do it. And if it doesn't, you don't.
Yeah. And trust me, like I know how lucky I am to be in that position. And I know what it's like to have to take everything that every opportunity that comes because you need to and you need to earn a certain amount of money from it and stuff. And, I did that for a number of years, but but I'm at the point now where, like you said, I kind of have this freedom to pick and choose the things I really want to do. And it's an amazing place to be creatively for sure. And, I don't want to waste it. So I want to take full advantage and really do things that feel like they matter to me and hopefully to the readers.
All right, I only have 2 more questions for you. One, I want to compliment Andrea in the form of a question. Andrea Sorrentino, just an absolute amazing artist. Total incredible fit for Joker Killer Smile. I was actually amazed by like how on vibe it was, even for Gideon Falls in some ways. But you get your question all the time of like, how do you do so much work? But honestly, how did he do both books at the same time? Gideon Falls didn't even take a break or anything, did it?
Yeah, well, we were really far ahead. I mean, it goes back to
knowing how this all works.
People, yeah, but this is gonna sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but there's not a lot of people in comics that work as hard as I do. I'll say I do have like a pretty insane work ethic, and so I've been lucky enough to find a couple collaborators who match that, and he's one of them. He is a workhorse. Ever since I started working with him on Green Arrow in, I guess, 2012 or whatever. It's like when you're working with Sorrentino on a book, every Monday morning at 8 a.m. you get an email like clockwork with 6 new pages or 5 every week. Just it's like a metronome. You can set your watch to it. He's a machine. So I don't know how he does it either. He's incredible. But so for Gideon, we were with both of us the way we both work like that. I'm always like a year ahead on scripts, and he works like that. So we were like an arc and a half ahead of whatever was coming out on Gideon, and it was like, well, let's just we could do something fun for a couple of months and then jump back without missing a beat. So we did,
Yeah, I had Ed Brubaker on the podcast recently, and I thought one of the most interesting things he said was like one of the things that pushes him the most and like keeps him going the most is the fact that he always knows he needs to be feeding Sean Phillips pages because he's so fast. And so it's like, it's like there's like
exactly.
There's like a comic deadline, but there's also it's like I need to feed Sean deadline. And like
I need to feed Andrea and I need to feed Dustin. And I love those guys, and so I just want to make sure I'm ahead of them so they're not waiting ever for me, you know?
Yeah. I just think it's amazing because it's like some people look at the deadline crunches as like killer in some ways, but at the same time, it's like Ed spoke about it in a way that made it seem like that is making him a better writer.
It does. I feel like the more you have to do, the more creative you're forced to be, the more creative you become. So if you don't have deadlines and you don't have people counting on you to deliver work or whatever, you can just sit around overthinking everything and never actually do much, you know. But when you have to produce, that's when the wheels really start turning, and that's when all the best ideas come, for me anyway. So that's why. It's the other reason people always ask why I do so much, but it's like I feel like I need all those projects because I never want. The more I have to do, the more creative I get, there's something about jumping between the different books constantly and always having to do the next script that it keeps me excited and keeps my creative juices kind of moving and not getting. As soon as I stop or slow down, that's when I have a tendency I'll start to overthink everything and and then I stop creating the same way. So I like to be busy. It's better for me.
I mean, that was one of the interesting things. Like during this quarantine, like I felt like it was almost like a perpetual motion machine. And it's like, as soon as I started like letting up, I started like getting kind of mired, you know? And it was kind of tricky to get out of that. But anyways, that's a whole path we could get down. But I want to close with the last time we talked, you had just had big adaptation news announced with the Black Hammer deal. And now it was announced that Sweet Tooth is going to be a series at Netflix. And I just want to start by saying, if you're interested in more adaptation deals, you're welcome on the podcast whenever you want, because apparently that is a thing that happens. But I did want to ask about, I'm sure you can't say much about this, but I want to ask about Sweet Tooth: The Return, which is a comic project you're working on. You can't say much, but I did want to ask, did the desire to revisit those characters and that world, because you got to a point where you had told their story, you'd completed that story.
Yeah.
Did that stem from revisiting that project for the show, or was it something else?
Well, yeah, it's all tied together, to be honest. I had told the story I wanted to tell with Sweet Tooth, especially. I'm really proud of the ending of Sweet Tooth, and I quite literally told the whole life story of that character right to the end. And I felt like, well, there's nothing to ever do with that world again. There's no room for another story, even if I wanted to. And I moved on. And then, a few things that happen. Part of it's the show, and part of it's every time I would do a convention. And I don't do a lot of conventions, but when I do, Sweet Tooth is still the one thing people seem the most, consistently the most passionate about. Like when the Sweet Tooth fans come up, they're just so passionate about it, and so emotionally invested in those characters. And I would do drawings of Gus or whatever, and every time I would do a drawing of those characters, it's almost like you realize how much you miss them, and I would realize how much I miss those characters and how much those characters mean to people. And so there's that, and so you're always like, man, if there's ever a way you could get back to do something with them, it would be really special. But I didn't have the story,
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm not sure how much I'm supposed to say about the show, but I was, fortunate enough to be involved with not involved creatively, but to be on set for the pilot and to kind of get caught up in the excitement of the adaptation and realizing how exciting that world is to all these people making the show. And it gets you thinking, and you get excited about it again. And I started searching for a story idea where I could somehow go back to the world, but not undo or diminish what I had done in the past with the characters. And I just couldn't find it. And then one day it popped in my head, and I honestly can't tell you anything about the series yet, but I got an idea that would continue the story, but also not undo anything that had been done, and felt like it added to it. And once I knew that I had an idea I believed in enough, it was just a no-brainer. Then of course I want to go back when I have the chance and do it, especially with the show coming out and everything. It can just be sort of a celebration of that world and everything I loved about it.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what we were talking about in the beginning, it's like ideas can come from anywhere. And it seems like in this case, it's almost like a reciprocal. It's like the enthusiasm others had for it reminded you of what you loved about it.
In a whole different way. Yeah. Because you kind of forget when you're in the middle, like when you're on issue 32 of Sweet Tooth, you're just like, oh God, I cannot draw this kid with antlers ever again. And I just can't wait for this to be done, you know? And then you get like 10 years away from it and you see how much those characters mean to people and the passion they have for bringing the story to life and the passion the fans have for it. And it makes you remember what it was that got you excited about it in the first place, you know, and you kind of reignites the original flame and gets you thinking. So, you know, it got me thinking and I started searching for a story and I didn't think I was going to find one. And then something popped in my head one day that made sense. And so I grabbed it, and I gotta say, I'm actively drawing the book now and have been for the last couple of months through all this. And it's been the timing's kind of weird because of the pandemic and the subject matter of the book. But at the same time, having this weird comfort of going back to that world has been such a blessing for me personally to keep me grounded and to keep my mind off the world a little bit. Have this sort of the comfort of those characters back in my life has been really, really special.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm looking forward to reading Cosmic Detective and everything else you're doing. Jeff, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk to me about all this stuff. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, awesome, man. Thanks for the great questions.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Jeff Lemire. You can find him on Twitter and Instagram at Jeff Lemire, and his work in the currently being Kickstarted graphic novel Cosmic Detective, as well as Gideon Falls, Black Hammer, and the upcoming Batman the Killer Smile. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all the site's content and its members only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow it on Twitter at SketchComic or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Greg Peterson, Stefan Hall, Dan Lee, Cameron Schrader, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Merritt, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Bacalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Harry Sayer, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slate, Sakil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Liana Kingus, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwan, Vita Ayala, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Elcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brandon Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Assey, Adam Bogart, Xavier Fowles, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, Dave Brawley, Ira James Udaskin, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Chipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Heifel, Fiona Staples, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.